Hey guys, welcome to today's book talk. I am so excited to be talking about A Gentleman in Moscow today. I absolutely adored this book. I gave it 5 stars. It was beautiful from start to finish, and I absolutely adored it. As always, the beginning of book talks are spoiler-free, so I'm just going to give you a quick sort of synopsis and review of the book, and then I will give you a little warning before I get into the actual spoilers of the book. So the main premise of A Gentleman in Moscow is this man, the Count, he ends up getting sentenced to a lifetime of house arrest in the Metropole Hotel, which is a famous hotel in Russia where he's been living. And essentially they say, look, if you ever leave this building, we're going to shoot you and you are stuck here for the rest of your life. Obviously being like part of the royalty kind of thing, he's lucky to even be alive, but it's a really fascinating story. You follow him through about 30 plus or so years of his life, of him living in this hotel. And I just thought this entire book was an absolutely incredible experience. I loved the side characters. I loved the way that he thought about things and the way that he sort of dissected things and his like inner thoughts and things. I loved, like I said, I loved pretty much every aspect of this book. So something that I've started doing is I will put notes in the back of pretty much every book that I read. I'll slap in a whole bunch of sticky notes, and I usually do a pros and cons list, and then I have like a place where I like quotes and characters and things like that. And I make a lot of notes while I'm reading. I didn't write down every single quote in the back of the book this time because I kind of just, there were so many things to quote in this book. I just started slapping in flags, and I will go back and finish making my notes at the back afterwards with all of the tabs that I threw in there. So as I was saying, I slap all these stickies in the back, and I usually start with a pros and cons list, and that is kind of what I'm going to get into right now. And again, these will be spoiler free still. But the thing with the pros and cons list that I found with this book were that a lot of the pros could potentially be cons for the wrong reader, for someone who just doesn't like this style of writing, I guess. So essentially, I loved it from the beginning, but it has this sort of quirky, sophisticated, if you could put those words together, like it's quirky, and the way that the Count thinks is a little bit quirky, but he's also so like refined and sophisticated and sweet. It's a very interesting balance, I found, but also I could see with the wrong reader, or not the wrong reader, but with a reader who doesn't like this sort of thing, I could see them seeing the book as kind of a pretentious sort of thing. To me, it didn't hit that way at all. I thought it was incredibly beautiful, but I could see how that would not be everyone's cup of tea. And then the next thing that I had here was that I was kind of getting J.M. Barrie, Marcus Zusak sort of vibes. So if you liked All the Light You Cannot See, and if you liked The Book Thief, or even Bridge of Clay, or Peter Pan, if you liked those quirky elements and the sort of overwritten nature and the tangents and the long explanations and like the inner thoughts, if you like that kind of stuff, then you'll probably adore this book. But I can, again, also see why that wouldn't resonate well with every single reader. Like I know, because I actually looked on Goodreads, and I know there's a decent handful of people who don't like that style of writing. And then the last thing that I did write down, because honestly I could write prose for days, most of the notes are just good things about the book anyway, but it does have a very intelligent child character, and I'm doing spoiler free, so I'm just gonna leave it at that for now. But I feel like some people don't like intelligent children. I feel like sometimes people think, well, they're written too intelligent for their age or something like that. I loved it. It reminded me of Elsa from from My Grandmother Sends Her Regards and Apologizes. The character in this book reminded me of Elsa from that book, and I loved that book, and I love Frederick Bachman, and I love anything that makes me think of that. I could go on for ages and ages and ages about all the things that I loved about this book. So if it sounds interesting at all to you, I would say pick it up. You can't go wrong. It is such a beautiful story, and I absolutely adored it. I was literally hooked from the very, very beginning when I was chuckling. He's in this court hearing about like what to do with him, but because he'd written this poem years before, they weren't as harsh with their punishments on him as they normally would have been with someone who like socialized with royalty and whatnot. So at one point in the interview, they ask him, "Why did you write the poem?" And he said, "It demanded to be written. I simply happened to be sitting at the particular desk on the particular morning when it chose to make its demands." And that quote in itself just kind of made me chuckle, and that was like in the very beginning of the book. I just had a good feeling about how this was gonna go, and I just thought it was fantastic. Anyway, I am gonna get into the spoilers now because I really don't think there's anything more I can say spoiler free. So I'm just gonna get into like all my favorite parts of the book, and you guys know how I do this. So if you've read the book, stick around and let's have a conversation down in the comments section. So as I said, this story is gorgeous. It's so well done. It's so well written. I loved the characters. I loved the dynamic. I loved the Count. I adored his personality. I thought he was so incredibly sweet. And I thought that this book was so incredibly quotable. Like there were just so many tabs, so many things. Like in the beginning, when they first sentence him to his house arrest and he gets sent to the hotel and he thinks that he's going to be living out his days in the same set of rooms that he always has, or the suite, is that what you call it, a suite? He goes back home to his suite only to find out that he can't stay in that part of the hotel anymore, and of course there had to be something to make the situation worse as like more of a punishment, and so they said pretty much like take what you can fit and you have to move into this teeny tiny little room upstairs and like far away from everybody else in the hotel. So he gets downgraded, and I found it really interesting because like if you were to think about if that would happen to you, how sad it is to lose things. And so I loved how his perspective, like his thought process, he kind of went through, you know, a little bit of nostalgia, looking at all of these heirlooms that he had around him and all of these things. He starts talking about his grandmother. So it goes back in time, and the Count is sort of telling this story about how he's playing a game with this boy and he lost and the Count didn't take it well. And his grandmother says, "There's nothing pleasant to be said about losing. And the Oblensky boy is a pill, but Sasha, my dear, why on earth would you give him this satisfaction?" And the Count sort of went into this whole experience of having to change where he was living and change his station and all this stuff as like, why give them the satisfaction of letting them see that like he's hurting or letting them see that he's disappointed. And he kind of just like took the bright side of things. And then he's going through and he's looking at all of his different like little possessions and heirlooms and all of these things. And then at the end of this long thing, he just says, "But of course, a thing is just a thing." And so I thought that was really interesting because a lot of times, like everybody does this, we get caught up with stuff, and sometimes like say someone breaks something of ours or wrecks something, like say they lose your book or they wreck your book or they spill something on it, or your kid draws in your journal or tears up a book, or I keep saying books, but like, you know, if they knock a picture off the wall, things like that. Sometimes, I know I do, I'll get really caught up in the fact that the thing is broken or that it can't be replaced, and sometimes I get a little bit mad, and then I have to remember that like people are more important than things and people are more precious than things. And again, I'm getting really deep, but like this book, it has a lot of themes in it that can be deeper. And so he ends up in this tiny little area in this tiny little room, and then I love that he managed to kick like a hole in the wall and he found his way into the room next door, and he actually made his rooms so much bigger. Sorry, I got a little bit lost there. I was trying to figure out exactly how things unfolded. I read this a couple weeks ago now, and so it's not all completely fresh in my mind. Usually I try to film these like 2 days after I've read it, just so that I don't forget anything. But anyway, after he gets this room, it's a really, really tiny space, and he ends up finding a way into the room next door, and he actually makes like a false back in his like wardrobe, and then nails the door shut from the inside on the room next to it, because if anybody found out that he had this secret place, obviously they would find a way to not let him have any more space than he was supposed to have. And I thought that was like really cheeky and neat the way that he did all of that. And then let's talk about Nina. Nina was so funny. I absolutely loved her. And Nina is obviously the little girl from the beginning that I mentioned. Nina reminded me of Elsa from that other book. I loved Nina's character. I thought she was so funny. She was so unapologetically herself, and she was very blunt. And I loved her personality. She was really funny. I loved how she just decided to go up to the Count and ask him where his mustache went. And I loved that they became like best friends. And I feel like this day and age, an older guy making friends with a little girl would be a lot more weird. But just when you know the Count's personality and you know his predicament, who else will like befriend him in such a way? And I feel like Nina gave him this sense of like imagination and wonder again. Like she took him all through the hotel because she knew every single nook and cranny, and they would go on these adventures and they would spy. And I loved reading all of that, and I was so heartbroken when she moved away and the Count she wasn't in the book anymore. And then the Count, I also loved how he didn't need to become a waiter or whatever they call them. He didn't have to work in the restaurant, but because he had such like a special place in his heart for the quality and the atmosphere of the place, he wanted a hand in taking care of it to preserve like the feel of the place and like the nostalgia of the place. And I loved his friends. I loved the cook and the maitre d'. I adored the friend group and the banter, and I thought it was so funny. And I got so angry when that stinking waiter took all the wrappers off the wine bottles just to be an asshole. Like, I was so mad when I read that part. Like, honestly, there are so many things in here. I don't even think I can cover them all in one video because it's so quotable and it's so good, and I just loved so many things. I'm gonna try and read some of my favorite quotes. So just going back to the beginning, I'm gonna go through the green tabs because they're the fewest. So I already read you guys the one that his grandmother said, but then there's like a part in the book where he goes through like that self-wallowing, like where he's contemplating suicide and he doesn't like know where his life is going because he probably just felt so monotonous. And at one point he says, but imagining what might happen if one's circumstances were different was the only sure route to madness. And it's like just made me think of like how people always think the grass is greener on the other side, but the grass is greener where you water it. I just thought that was super interesting. And then, sorry, some of these tabs are hard to tell the difference between the green and the yellow. So this is after he meets Anna, who I also loved. And oh man, I just thought she was great. And I feel like I forgot to put a tab in somewhere, but whatever. So So essentially at one point the Count is thinking in his head, you may accuse a dog of eating without grace or of exhibiting a misplaced enthusiasm for the tossing of sticks, but you may never accuse one of giving up hope. And that just made me chuckle so much because one, I'm a dog lover, but two, it is so true. And this is the part where the dogs have all but been had by that cat and the cat takes off and the dogs still think that there's some way that they can catch it. And I just thought that was so funny. And then obviously the Count had not the best feelings towards Anna when he first met her in the hotel. He thought she was kind of cold and harsh. And then you get a little bit further in and it says, after all, what can a first impression tell us about someone we've just met for a minute in the lobby of a hotel? For that matter, what can a first impression tell us about anyone? Why, no more than a chord can tell us about Beethoven or a brushstroke about Botticelli. By their very nature, human beings are so capricious, so complex, so delightfully contradictory, that they deserve not only our consideration, but our reconsideration, and our unwavering determination to withhold our opinion until we have engaged with them in every possible setting, at every possible hour. And I thought that was so good. Like, wow. That just, ain't that the truth? Like, isn't that so true? We get so much of like a feel for someone on like a first impression, or you look at something and it's just your first impression isn't always wrong, but sometimes your first impression is someone having a bad day, like Anna. Like, it's so, there's so much more than a one-time meeting to get out of another person, and you need to give them multiple chances and multiple situations to really, like, gain an idea of what that person is really like. And I just thought that was such a good quote, I just loved that so much. And then, obviously, Nina comes back and she brings Sophia, and she leaves her daughter with the Count, and then Nina goes off to find her husband and, like, disappears and never shows up ever again. And I was gutted when we found out Nina was never coming back. Like, I just felt so sad for her. But then I also thought it was pretty amazing because I don't know, in my mind, I guess I just assumed, like, to me, I felt sad that the Count, if he wanted a family, I don't know if he did or not, but if that was ever something that he had wanted, at this point, there was no way he was ever going to get it. And between all of the friendships that he forged at the hotel and then having Sophia become his daughter, he did get to experience, like, family, even though he was trapped in a hotel and held there forever, or kept there forever. But there's one part where he's kind of, like, freaking out and he doesn't know what to do with her, and he tries to kind of pawn her off on Marina because he doesn't know what to do. And she says, if you're ever in doubt, just remember that unlike adults, children want to be happy. So they still have the ability to take the greatest pleasure in the simplest things. Which is hilarious because anyone who's ever seen a kid get a toy that came in a big box, in fact, they will love the big box more than the thing that came in it 9 times out of 10. If not 10 times out of 10. And, like, that's not to say they won't like the thing that came in the box, but that box is like magic to them. And it is the simplest piece of junk, and they just think it is so amazing, and they just think it's the best. And I just, like, guys, do you feel me? Like, this book is so quotable. It's so good. So now we're on to the guy who works at the embassy in Moscow, the American guy, Richard. And it says that they clinked their glass with a toast to old friends. Some might wonder that the two men should consider themselves to be old friends, having only known each other for 4 years, but the tenure of friendships has never been governed by the passage of time. And again, another one that just hit me right in the feels, because while I do have some friends who are close to me from, like, 20 years ago, which is crazy to think about, but, like, I have friends still from kindergarten, but I have also friends that I've met in the last 5 or 6 years that are some of my best friends, and I've known them for such a short period of time, but I really adore them, and I would tell them anything, and I can tell them anything, and, like, sometimes you just meet the right people and they just click and you become such fast, great friends that it doesn't matter if you've known each other for 5 months or 20 years, you have just this bond that you get with certain people, and it's just such a special experience. And then this one, okay, so this is when Sophia, I think, doesn't want to go on her, she's, like, in the choir, or not the choir, she's in the orchestra, and she doesn't want to go. And it says, yes, a parent should share his hesitations, and then take 3 or 4 steps back so that the child can make a decision by herself, even when that decision may lead to disappointment. And I thought that was really incredible, especially as a parent, because it's totally true. Like, yes, you need to guide them, and yes, you can give your opinion, but at the end of the day, I mean, granted, ages matter, and different ages mean different levels of making their own decisions, but it's important to let them also find their own way and make mistakes in, like, a way that you can guide them in the right direction. Does that make sense? I thought that was really incredible and really neat, especially for when they're older and, like, you've done most of the rearing and most of the growing up with them, and eventually you have to let them make their own mistakes and kind of forge their own path so that they can learn how to, like, adult. And I just thought that was pretty incredible. Okay, before I read this, I only have one quote left in the book, but I'm gonna really quickly, so we know that Sophia ended up going to Paris, and the Count found a way for him to get out of the hotel and for her to escape Russia, all this big, like, master plan, and she managed to get away. And okay, so this is the only part that I didn't love, was that I I felt like Sophia's perspective didn't really get wrapped up, but like I can only assume that either she stayed in Paris or she went to America. I'm not really sure how that worked out, but it was bittersweet because yes, she's safe and she's not in Russia, but also bittersweet because the Count and her, like it never had like a reuniting moment between them, so that was a little bit sad, but also she was able, like she was free, and so she could really live her own life, so I thought that was a little bit bittersweet. And then that ending, when the Count went in and he finds Anna in that little like tavern or restaurant or whatever that was there, I just thought that was so sweet. Like I absolutely, like I feel like when this comes out as a show, I'm just gonna cry when that part comes around, and I thought that was such a sweet, it wasn't like a really big flashy ending, but it was a very like feel good ending. Like it was good. Like I was convinced that he was gonna get killed. Like I was for sure, I thought he was gonna get shot and I was gonna end like crying and sadness, and it ended up being like happiness, so I was really glad. But on his way to, I can't even say the place that he's going, Nizhny Novgorod, I don't know how to say that. Anyway, he's on his way there, or he gets there. So he's kind of walking up and he's walking past that old, where his old house would have been, like where he had all these childhood memories and where he grew up with his sister. And so then he goes on and he says, "Why, after so many years of longing for home, did these sojourners abandon it so shortly upon their return? It is hard to say, but perhaps for those returning after a long absence, the combination of heartfelt sentiments and the ruthless influence of time can only spawn disappointments. The landscape is not as beautiful as one remembered it, the local cider is not as sweet, and quaint buildings have been restored beyond recognition, while fine old traditions have lapsed to make way for mystifying new entertainments." And I'm not going to read every single thing, but it goes down a little bit longer, and then it says, and it's talking about him, and it says, "This traveler stood before the ruins of his old home. He was not overcome by shock, indignation, or despair. Rather, he exhibited the same smile, at once wistful and serene, that he exhibited upon seeing the overgrown road. For as it turns out, one can revisit the past quite pleasantly, as long as one does so expecting nearly every aspect of it to have changed." And I just thought that was so, like, I can't say it enough. I just find that this book was so incredibly well written. There were heartbreaking moments. There were such, like, happy, sweet, loving moments. I loved that the Count got to experience being a father. I loved how well he took care of Sophia and that he took her in as his own. I loved that he didn't use his, like, station to be better than other people. I loved the way that he was written. And this book brought me to happy tears, brought me to sad tears multiple times. I loved his friend Mishka, his best friend. I loved him. The part where you find out that it was actually Mishka's poem that saved the Count's life was so, oh my goodness. Like when I read that part, I like read it 3 times and I was reading it through tears, and like the Count would have been put to the wall had he not broken the rules while he was like still royal or whatever, and wrote and published this poem for Mikhail, but then later on it saved his life, and oh my goodness, it just broke my heart so much. Anyway, I don't know what else to say. I think I've pretty much covered everything that I can. I've literally talked about the entire book. I just loved this so much, and I would love to hear from you guys if any of you have actually made it to this point in the video. I know this one is probably especially long, but this book is just definitely became one of my favorite ones of the year, but I think probably one of my favorite books of all time. Like every time I think about it, I love it even more than I thought I did. So anyway, let me know down below, did you love this book? Did you hate this book? Let me know your thoughts and feelings. It's okay if you didn't feel the same as me. I'd love to have like a discussion. I think it's very interesting to hear different viewpoints as well as the same viewpoints. Super interesting to hear from different people. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already and hit the bell next to it so you don't miss any future videos. I upload most Mondays and Thursdays, and I will talk to you guys soon. Thank you so much. Bye.